Hi, and welcome to 10 Days to More Creativity, to Greater Creativity. This is day 2. The last time I talked about people giving you a creative test and about how you might be failing that test. Today I'm going to ask you to make a test. You're not necessarily going to give that test to other people. You're going to have that test for yourself, and you're going to have that test for anybody who's teaching you creativity, and that includes me. Because how are you going to know if you're more creative or if you have greater creativity if you don't have any way to measure it, if you don't have any standards? So it might be easy for me to say, well, make a test of creativity, but I really need to explain to you first why. You see, a lot of materials for creativity that I've found teach to the test. What do I mean by that? Well, in public schools, sometimes teachers teach students to the test. That is, they only teach them the topics, the subjects, the formulas, the definitions that will get the students to pass a certain written test. And unfortunately, this is happening a little bit in creativity. You see, there are some creativity tests out there that tell you how creative you are. And a lot of the materials that you can find on creativity address these certain areas. There's a test out there that will test how many ideas you can come up with. And there's more testing that can be done to see if you can come up with the most unusual idea of anybody you're tested against. There are also creative problem-solving tests that see if you can get the solution that the person who made the test wants you to get, and they see how fast you can get it. Well, the problem is that you don't always think like the person that made the test, and that includes coming up with the most ideas, coming up with the most unusual ideas, or coming up with the ideas that solve the problem the way that the person set up the test. But there are lots of other creativities out there. So you shouldn't be worried about those tests. You should be worried about the one that you're going to make. Now, I invite you to make your own test, but I realize that might be kind of hard if you've never made a test before. Where do you start? So I'll give you some simple guidelines, but I really hope you get into looking at what kind of creativity do you want. Maybe you do want to come up with more ideas. Maybe you want to come up with ideas faster. Maybe you want to come up with ideas when you're under a deadline and you're not able to relax. Maybe the creativity you want's in a certain area or to solve a certain problem. There are lots of ways that you can look at creativity and know that you're getting more creative. But one of the things I really want to caution you against is not necessarily judging yourself as more creative by how you feel, because that's what I hear a lot in workshops. Well, this is wonderful. I feel more creative. And it sort of makes my heart sink, because that feeling isn't always the best indicator. It isn't always the best way to measure how creative you are. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I've gotten up in the middle of the night with a wonderful idea for a book and I write it down and I go back to bed, I get up in the morning and I look at it and I think, what? What was I thinking? Why did I think this was creative? Or I might be working on a project and I'm really getting into the flow and I'm just feeling it and it's just coming so easily, and I'm just going at it. And I set it aside in a couple days and I look at it and I know I felt creative in that moment, but it wasn't quite, when I look at it again, it doesn't quite match up with my memory. It isn't quite as good or exactly what I thought it was or wanted it to be. Sometimes, truth be told, our creativity comes when it hurts. It takes everything we've got to drag it out of us, and It doesn't feel creative at the time. It really doesn't. But you set it aside for a couple days and you come back to it and you're amazed at what you've done because you didn't think it was worth anything. But when you look at it, it is. So that's one reason I want you to avoid thinking that you're more creative necessarily by how you feel in the moment or you feel right after you've been making something or doing something. So one of the ways to measure is to think about in 10 days for this video series, how will I know that I'm more creative or have greater creativity? Well, where would you ultimately like to be? You know, what's your goal? What's your purpose? You can set that at the top. But let's be honest, in 10 days, what do you expect? You might want to be here, but what do you expect? Like how far are you going to be? If you're being a little more pessimistic, not over the moon, where do you expect? Write these down. This is what I want. This is what I expect. For your creativity test, you also need to know where you're starting. What's your starting line? You might want to get to the mountain, and you might only expect to get halfway up, or maybe even a third, or, well, we won't go that far down. But where are you starting? How are you creative now? What is the normal for you? Write that down. What is it that you do to be creative? What are your inspirations? What's your baseline? What are we starting with? The most important part for this way to make a creativity test, because there are a lot of other ones that you can make, is what's below your baseline. How do you know when you're backsliding, when you're getting a step down, or when you're stuck and in a slump? That's important to know too, because when you realize that you're starting to go downhill, you want to put on the brakes. So what's below it? If I'm going to use the frequency, if you can come up with 5 ideas at a time and that's normal for you, and all of a sudden you're only coming up with 2 or 0, well, you know, the creativity tool that you're using, the skill, the things that you're using to inspire yourself, that might not be working. You might have to set them aside. You might be able to bring them back and they'll be useful another time, or you might have to let go of them altogether. So know not only what you want, what you expect, what your baseline is, but also know kind of what hitting bottom or hitting below the baseline is, so that you have some sort of test, some sort of way to measure how you're doing as you're working through your creativity, because it is work. It's worth it, but it is work sometimes. You will get into flow a lot easier the more you practice, but like any other thing, it does take some time, it does take some work. So now I want you to think about your standards, all these that you have, and I want you to use this test, measure it against my video series, measure it against other books, other creative tools. Have this test, but keep in mind that, you know, one test doesn't always work for everything. One size doesn't fit all. So you may need more than one creativity test to know where you're going. All I'm asking you to do for this one is make up a test. Write down the 4 things that I ask you, and then at least you'll have a starting point to measure and to hold me accountable, to hold yourself accountable, to see if you're going to be more creative. You really do want to have something, some kind of standard. Yesterday I made cloud bread, and it looks like real bread. It takes 3 ingredients, takes eggs, cream cheese, and baking soda, or actually it's baking powder, and it looks like a half of a hamburger roll. It tastes pretty close to bread, but you know, it isn't bread. The texture is just not right. And you can go to a science store and you can buy fake snow, and you can put ice water in it, fluff it up. It looks like the real thing, but it just isn't quite right. It just doesn't. It doesn't have that right texture, and so you need to know what kind of creativity you want, what your standards are, because there are a lot of things out there that seem creative, just like getting up in the middle of the night and writing something and then waking up the next morning and it wasn't. Well, if you have some kind of test, you'll be able to measure and see if it's the real deal, if it's really making you more creative. And that's all I have for this time. I hope you'll join me next time, because I'm going to really get into some creativity tools that I hope will start to get you thinking about creativity in some really different, unusual ways, and maybe useful ways as well, but also ways that make creativity more about what you think creativity is than what I think it is. So I hope you join me, and thanks for listening.